promise to elevate someone with public school experience. Gina Raimondo will soon become the former governor of Rhode Island as she prepares to take the top job at the Commerce Department. And pending the Senate's approval, Dr. Cecilia Rouse will soon become the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. This morning, I want to pause for a moment to recognize the historic nature of the nominees that President Biden has nominated and that the Senate has confirmed in the first month of the nascent administration. So far, the Senate has promoted the first Black Secretary of Defense and the first woman to serve as Deputy Secretary of Defense. After an unbroken streak of 77 male secretaries in a row, all the way back to Alexander Hamilton, the Senate confirmed the first woman to serve as Treasury Secretary. By the end of the day, we'll have confirmed the first Black woman to lead the Council of Economic Advisors, the first Latino and the first immigrant to lead the Department of Homeland Security, the second Black woman to serve as UN Ambassador, the third Latino to serve as Education Secretary, and the first openly gay secretary of any cabinet agency. Cabinet agencies, we all know, have an immense influence over the policy of the United States. It's critical for their leaders to have lived experiences that represent the broad spectrum of Americans those agencies serve. Not only that, but the nominees I just mentioned are some of the most qualified public servants in America and are already hard at work at delivering results for the American people. The Senate will continue to confirm more nominees as quickly as possible. The process can certainly move more quickly with the cooperation of our Republican colleagues, whose states and constituents benefit equally from having these qualified nominees in place. Now on COVID. As early as tomorrow, the Senate will begin work on the American Rescue Plan. As the country faces a series of historic challenges, we must meet the moment with a historic response. Millions of jobs and trillions of dollars have been taken out of our economy. Thousands of small businesses are holding on for dear life. And tens of millions of Americans are struggling with the rent, groceries, medicine, and utilities. Only a week ago, the United States crossed the tragic milestone of 500,000 deaths from COVID-19, a stark reminder that the pandemic isn't done with us yet. Over the past year, Congress has stepped up to the plate to pass important relief measures, but the job is not complete. The American Rescue Plan is designed to finish the job, to patch up the holes in our economy and lay a foundation for recovery, to keep struggling businesses, families, and workers afloat until brighter days appear on the horizon, to send our children back to school as quickly and safely as possible, and to defeat this evil disease once and for all. That's what the American people sent us here to do. That's what our government is for. Not to sit back and wait for problems to fix themselves, not to cross our fingers and hope the economy will recover on its own. Our job is to end through action the current state of the crisis and hasten the day when our country and all of our lives can return to normal. The bottom line, if you look at the trajectory, every time we put in a relief bill, in March, the economy got better. In June and July. We put a relief bill in December, and now the numbers look a little better for January. But the economy is not strong enough to sustain things on its own. We need strong relief to get the economy going so it can continue on an upward path on its own. That's what this bill is designed to do. I fear most economists, Secretary Yellen, Chairman Powell, if we do too little or nothing, the economy could stay mired in recession for all too long a time, just as it did when we didn't do enough in 2009, and the economy stayed in recession for many years after the financial crisis. Now, on voting rights. In our American system, we talk a lot about perfecting our union, a reference to the preamble of the Constitution, a document which effectively gave only white male landowners the right to vote in our fledgling democracy. Suffice it to say, there is a lot of perfecting to do. As I think about my Democratic caucus, incidentally, it's probably so that less than half of them could actually vote in the elections of 1789, because I believe in many states you had to be a white, male, Protestant property owner. Not so many of those around here. So over the course of 230 years, We've passed scores of laws and amended the Constitution to reflect the flaws in our democracy and expand these franchise to all our citizens, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the 14th, 15th, 19th, 23rd, 24th, and 26th Amendments, just to name a few. Despite all this progress, there is now, in the 21st century, a concerted effort to roll back voting rights in state legislatures across the country, alarmingly making it harder for Americans to vote, and particularly aimed at Americans of color, African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans. And it's becoming a feature of one of America's major political parties. Yesterday, I detailed a number of laws pushed by Republicans in state legislatures to limit the amount of time that Americans have to vote, to frustrate election administration in urban areas and around college campuses, to impose overly burdensome ID requirements and absurd written witness and signature requirements for absentee ballots. Maybe most pernicious of all, Republicans in Georgia have coalesced around a plan to end all early voting on Sundays, a day when black churches organize voter drives, with no good reason given, none. The threat to voting rights in America is now very real. It must be opposed in every state house and governor's mansion in this country. And the threat extends all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. 8 years ago, a conservative 5-4 majority on the court gutted the Voting Rights Act by essentially rendering meaningless Section 5 of the statute, a provision which prevented the implementation of undue voting restrictions in states with a history of discrimination. Chief Justice Roberts suggested that the era of widespread discrimination, which led to the enactment of the Voting Rights Act, was over, and there was no longer a need for the critical portions of the statute. Well, within 24 hours after the ruling had been handed down, Texas announced it would implement a strict voter ID law. Soon thereafter, Mississippi and Alabama followed with laws that had previously been barred by the Justice Department. Republican leaders in the state of North Carolina passed a suite of voter suppression laws that a federal judge found, quote, targeted African American voters with surgical precision. Think about that. This was not a ruling from the Reconstruction era or Jim Crow. It was only a few years ago. At a time when an African American man elected by the most diverse coalition in the history of American politics occupied the White House, Republicans in North Carolina passed voting laws so pernicious that even the Roberts Court, among the most conservative we've seen on this issue of voting rights, could not ignore the overwhelming stench of discrimination. That's what it was, a stench, rooted in America's sordid history of voter suppression and discrimination against black voters. Well, today the Supreme Court will hear another case concerning the Voting Rights Act, this time about Section 2, a section which Chief Justice Roberts referred to in his Shelby County ruling as a necessary failsafe to police discriminatory voting procedures nationwide. As one news outlet reported this morning, there is every possibility that the High Court could make it more difficult or practically impossible to challenge voting restrictions in the future, unquote, warning that another ruling against the law could render the Voting Rights Act, quote, a dead letter, unquote. That is what's at stake in America right now. As state legislatures move to restrict voting rights from one end of the country to the other, the law we rely on to prevent outright discrimination at the ballot box is at risk of being, quote, a dead letter. This is one of the most appalling things I've seen in this country after 4 years of an appalling administration. This is just incredible. It burns my blood and should burn the blood of every fair-minded American, Republican, Democrat, Independent, liberal, conservative. After centuries of expanding the right to vote, of struggling to get that right to vote, these pernicious, self-serving proposed laws to cut back on the right to vote Will the Supreme Court let that happen? So against what America's all about. So, we cannot stand by and do nothing as these rights are diluted or stripped away. Congress must pursue a restoration of the Voting Rights Act, and by all accounts should be working in a bipartisan way to make it easier, safer, and more convenient for all Americans to vote. The judgment of history has never been kind to those who work against the full participation of their fellow citizens in our democratic experiment. I yield the floor.